They threw wine, on him not knowing he was the mob boss. The next day, they wake up tied up. Comment what you thought of this story with a rating from 0 to 10 and tell me what city you're watching from. I really want to know if you like my story and want to get to know you better, so subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The city of New York City sizzled under the December heat, its avenues gridlocked, and the constant hum of millions of lives intersecting without ever truly touching. In the heart of this gigantic metropolis, where glass skyscrapers reflected the grey afternoon sky, Emily Hayes adjusted for the 5th time the black and white uniform that identified her as part of the catering team hired for the most exclusive party of the season. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tied her apron, not from ordinary nervousness, but from a mixture of contained anger and necessity that always accompanied her whenever she had to serve these people. Arthur Vance's penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of one of the most luxurious buildings on Park Avenue, with a panoramic view that stretched from Central Park to the distant lights of the outer boroughs, where Emily had grown up and where her mother still battled daily the illness that had been corroding her lungs since she was widowed. The penthouse was an obscene display of wealth. With its 3,000 square feet of imported marble floors, crystal chandeliers dripping from the soaring ceiling, and contemporary artworks that cost more than Emily would earn in 10 lifetimes of honest work. She observed everything with watchful eyes as she arranged trays of canapés and glasses of French champagne, mentally recording every detail of this world that was as distant to her as the surface of the moon. The women circulated in designer dresses that cost the equivalent of a year's rent, their faces stretched by expensive cosmetic procedures, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, while the men discussed million-dollar deals as if they were talking about the weather. Emily had learned, over 3 years of working at events like this, to become invisible, to move among the guests like an efficient shadow that appeared only when needed and disappeared the moment her function was fulfilled. The party celebrated the merger of 2 major real estate development firms, a deal that would move billions of dollars and further consolidate Arthur Vance's empire in the New York real estate market. The host, a 60-year-old man with impeccably styled grey hair and a smile that never reached his cold eyes, moved among the guests with the ease of someone born into that environment of power and privilege. At his side, like a walking trophy, his daughter Olivia Vance flaunted her youth and beauty with the natural arrogance of someone who had never had to fight for anything in life. Emily felt the familiar weight of revolt tighten her chest as she passed the group where Olivia was laughing loudly, surrounded by equally privileged friends, making malicious comments about the waitstaff serving the party. The 23-year-old blonde, in her turquoise dress that had certainly cost a fortune, made no effort to lower her voice as she criticized the appearance of the employees, as if they were furniture without ears or feelings. It was then that Emily saw him for the first time. A man who clearly did not belong in that environment, whose broad shoulders strained the fabric of a suit that was not custom-made, whose arms displayed tattoos that crept up to his neck, barely concealed by his shirt sleeves. He moved uncomfortably among the guests, his dark eyes scanning the room with an intensity that contrasted dramatically with the superficiality of the conversations around him. There was something dangerous about him, an aura of contained power that made people instinctively move away as he approached. Jack Riley was there for a specific reason that had nothing to do with social networking or admiration for the New York elite. He had spent weeks planning his infiltration of the party, using underworld contacts to obtain a forged invitation that would grant him access to Arthur Vance's inner circle. His private investigation had revealed suspicious connections between the development firm and money laundering schemes that affected his own businesses in the Bronx, and he needed to confirm his suspicions before taking any more drastic action. But maintaining the facade of belonging in that environment was proving more difficult than he had anticipated. Every disdainful look he received, every conversation that died when he approached, every false smile followed by malicious whispers as soon as he passed, all of it rekindled old memories of humiliation and rejection he thought he had buried under layers of power and intimidation. Jack Riley, the man who controlled entire territories in the Bronx, who made corrupt politicians tremble with a simple phone call, who moved millions in operations beyond the law's reach, suddenly felt small and inadequate in that room full of people who despised him simply for existing. The explosion came when Olivia Vance, already intoxicated by a combination of champagne and power, decided she needed a new form of entertainment to liven up the party. Her eyes gleamed with malice as they landed on Jack, and she whispered something to her boyfriend Ethan, a young man with delicate features and a bored air who came from a traditional New York family. The two approached with a group of friends, their laughter echoing too loudly in the already noisy room. Emily was just a few feet away when it all happened. She saw Olivia approach Jack with a full glass of red wine in her hand, saw the cruel smile that formed on the girl's painted lips, heard the venomous phrase she uttered before deliberately pouring the dark liquid over the tattooed man's head. The wine ran down Jack's face, staining his white shirt, dripping onto the marble floor as Olivia and her friends burst into laughter. The circle of guests around them opened up, creating a space of public humiliation where Jack stood alone, motionless, the wine dripping down his neck and soaking his clothes. What impacted Emily the most was not the violence of the act itself, but Jack's reaction. He didn't scream, didn't retaliate physically, didn't do any of the things a normal person would do in the face of such humiliation. Instead, he just stood there, his entire body tense, like a rope about to snap, while his dark eyes fixed on Olivia's face with an intensity that made the girl's laughter die in her throat for a brief second before she regained her bravado. There were terrible promises in that look, consequences that transcended any immediate reaction. Security was called immediately. Two burly men in black suits escorted Jack to the private elevator, while Arthur Vance apologized to the guests for the unpleasant incident, assuring them that the intruder would be dealt with appropriately. Emily watched, paralyzed, her tray of canapes forgotten in her hands, feeling a wave of indignation so powerful it almost made her scream. She knew that kind of humiliation, had experienced variations of it her whole life, every time someone from the elite treated her as inferior simply because of her humble origins. Without thinking of the consequences, Emily left her tray on a nearby table and discreetly followed towards the hallway leading to the elevators. The security guards had already gone down with Jack, but she managed to catch up with him in the ground floor lobby, where he was wiping his face with his hands, the wine still dripping down his neck. She approached with a handful of clean napkins she had grabbed from the kitchen, extending them to him without saying anything at first. Jack looked at her with suspicion, his eyes assessing whether this waitress was another person sent to complete his humiliation. But something in Emily's expression, a mixture of genuine compassion and shared anger, made him accept the napkins. She waited as he cleaned his face, her hands trembling slightly with the adrenaline of the moment. It was Emily who broke the silence. Her voice came out low but firm when she said that what they had done to him was unfair and cruel, that those people upstairs thought they were superior simply because they were born with money, but that deep down they were empty and mediocre. She talked about how she had worked at these parties for years, how she had learned to be invisible to survive, how every night she went home feeling smaller and more insignificant, but that she continued because she needed to support her family. Jack watched her speak with growing interest, There was fire in this woman, a flame of revolt and dignity that he recognized because it burned within him too. He asked her name, and when she replied, Emily Hayes, he committed it to memory, along with every detail of her face. The brown eyes that shone with intelligence, the dark hair tied back in a practical bun, the straight posture despite the simple uniform. She didn't know who he really was, had no idea of the power he commanded or the terrible things he was capable of. And perhaps it was precisely this innocence that made her so attractive in that moment. He thanked her with a brevity that revealed nothing of his intentions, and then disappeared into the New York night, leaving Emily with a strange feeling in her chest, as if something important had just happened, but she couldn't quite define what. She returned to the party, resumed her mechanical duties of serving and cleaning, but her mind kept returning to that tattooed man and the look he had given Olivia Vance, a look that promised consequences. What Emily didn't know, as she finished her shift in the early hours of the morning and took the bus back home to the outer boroughs, was that Jack was already setting in motion a series of events that would change their lives forever. While she slept in the small apartment she shared with her sick mother and teenage brother, he gathered his most trusted team in an abandoned warehouse in the Bronx, drawing up meticulous plans for a revenge that would be both personal and strategic. The next morning dawned grey and damp, with the threat of rain hanging in the warm December air. Emily woke up early as always, prepared simple coffee, and helped her mother with her medication before leaving for another day of work. Her old cell phone rang when she was on the crowded bus heading downtown, and the tense voice of her supervisor at the catering company informed her that she needed to come to the office urgently. The office was in a decaying commercial building in an older part of downtown, where the events company occupied a small, poorly ventilated room on the third floor. Emily climbed the stairs with a bad feeling tightening her stomach, and her intuition was confirmed when she found two police detectives waiting for her along with her supervisor. They had questions about the previous night's party, specifically about the incident involving a man who had been kicked out of the event. That's how Emily discovered that Olivia Vance and her boyfriend Ethan had disappeared. The two had left the party together around 3 in the morning and never made it home. Their cell phones were off, their cars were found abandoned in a Soho parking garage, and Arthur Vance was mobilizing every imaginable resource to find his daughter. The police were questioning everyone who worked at the party, looking for any information about suspicious people, strange behavior, anything that could indicate what had happened. Emily answered the questions honestly, mentioning the wine incident, but omitting her later encounter with the man in the lobby. Something prevented her from sharing that detail, a protective instinct she couldn't rationally explain. The detective seemed frustrated with the lack of useful information, but eventually released her with instructions to contact them immediately if she remembered anything relevant. As she returned home on the bus, Emily followed the news on her phone. Olivia Vance's disappearance already dominated the headlines, with speculation ranging from kidnapping to a romantic getaway. Arthur Vance appeared in interviews offering generous rewards for information, his usually controlled expression cracked by genuine paternal concern. Emily felt a pang of guilt as she realized her first reaction to hearing of the disappearance had been a dark satisfaction, as if justice had finally caught up with that spoiled, cruel girl. The afternoon was already fading when Emily arrived home and found a thick envelope that someone had slipped under her door. There was no sender or addressee, just her name written in firm letters on the front. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and found a wad of cash equivalent to 6 months of her salary, along with a short note that just said an address and a time, 10 o'clock that night. Emily knew she should ignore it, should take the envelope straight to the police, should do the right and sensible thing. But something stronger than common sense compelled her to keep the money and wait for the night. She spent the next few hours in a state of nervous agitation, preparing dinner for her family with automatic movements, while her mind spun in circles, trying to understand what was happening. When she finally left home at 9 o'clock, telling her mother she had an extra last-minute job, Emily felt as if she were walking towards a precipice from which there would be no return. The address led her to an industrial neighborhood in the Bronx, where abandoned warehouses rose like skeletons against the night sky. A black car was waiting at the indicated corner, and when she approached hesitantly, the back door opened to reveal Jack in the back seat. He looked different this time, without the uncomfortable suit, wearing only dark jeans and a black t-shirt that fully revealed his elaborate tattoos. His eyes assessed her with the same intensity as the night before, but there was something more in them now. A kind of recognition that made Emily's heart race dangerously. He didn't waste time with preliminaries, getting straight to the point, explaining that she had been a witness to what happened at the party, that her act of kindness in the lobby had caught his attention, and that he needed someone from outside his usual circle to help him with information about the Vance family. Emily interrupted him to ask directly if he was involved in Olivia and Ethan's disappearance. Jack didn't deny it, and his brutal honesty was simultaneously terrifying and strangely refreshing. He explained that the two were safe, but being held, that they would not be harmed as long as certain conditions were met, and that Emily could help him ensure everything ended without unnecessary violence. All he needed was basic information about the Vance family's routine, about the people close to Arthur, about any detail she might have observed during the events she worked. Emily's first reaction was horror. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't involved in this. She couldn't just cooperate with a kidnapping, even if the victims were terrible people. But Jack stopped her from leaving the car with a firm hand on her arm, and then began to talk about justice, about how the legal system would never punish people like Olivia Vance for their casual cruelty, about how the police work to protect the rich while ignoring crimes committed against the poor. He casually mentioned that he knew the story of her father, the construction worker who had died in an accident on one of Arthur Vance's construction sites 5 years ago. Emily felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. How did he know about her father? Jack explained that he had investigated her after their encounter in the lobby, discovering not only her personal history, but also disturbing details about her father's death. The accident had not been accidental, but the result of purposeful negligence by the construction company, which cut safety costs to increase profits. Arthur Vance knew the risks and chose to ignore them. And when the accident happened, he used his power and influence to cover up investigations and buy the silence of the authorities. Jack's words hit Emily like sharp knives, opening old wounds she thought had scarred over. She had always suspected something was wrong with the official version of her father's death, had always felt that the ridiculous compensation they received and the quick closure of the investigations had been orchestrated by someone with a lot of power. But hearing the confirmation of her worst suspicions, knowing that the man responsible for the destruction of her family was the same one she served champagne to at luxurious parties, was devastating. Jack let her process this information in silence, watching the emotions cross her face. Shock, pain, anger, and finally a cold determination that he recognized because he saw it in the mirror every day. When Emily finally spoke again, her voice was different, harder and more controlled. She asked what exactly he wanted from her, and Jack smiled for the first time since they had met. Over the following weeks, Emily found herself living a double life that exhausted her physically and emotionally. During the day, she continued to work at events, smiling politely at the same wealthy clients who didn't see her as a person, returning home to care for her mother and help her brother with his homework. But at night, she frequently met with Jack in different locations around the city, passing on information she gathered discreetly, answering questions about people and places, gradually becoming an essential piece in the complex operation he was orchestrating. What began as a cold transaction based on shared revenge started to transform into something more complicated and frightening. Emily discovered that Jack was not the one-dimensional monster the media painted when reporting on crime in the outer boroughs. He had his own moral code, rigid and inflexible, that prioritized loyalty above all else. He took care of the people in his community in ways the government never did, funding renovations in local schools, employing young people who would otherwise fall into crime, protecting residents from police abuse. His methods were brutal when necessary, but there was a logic and even a certain justice to the way he operated. He was also surprisingly intelligent, not just in terms of street smarts, but genuinely well-read. Emily was shocked to discover that he read voraciously, that he had articulate opinions on politics and society, that he understood nuances of economics and power that many with formal educations did not grasp. His tattoos, which she had initially seen as marks of violence and criminality, told complex stories of loyalty, loss, and survival. Each design had meaning. Each line represented a choice or an important person in his life. During their nightly conversations, often in his car circling the illuminated city, they began to share more than just tactical information. Jack talked about his childhood in Hunts Point, about the mother who worked 3 jobs and still barely managed to feed her children, about the older brother killed at 15 in a confrontation with the police, about the impossible choices that poverty forces upon people. Emily, in turn, opened up about her own fears and frustrations, about the feeling of invisibility that suffocated her in her work, about the dreams she had buried when her father died and she had to take on adult responsibilities at 19. The physical attraction between them grew with each encounter, a palpable tension that filled the limited space of the car and made it hard to breathe. Emily fought against this desire because she knew it was wrong, that Jack represented everything she should reject: violence, criminality, a future without security or stability. But at the same time, he saw her in a way no one else did, treated her as an equal, valued her intelligence and courage in ways that made her heart race dangerously. The situation with Olivia and Ethan remained at a controlled impasse. Jack kept them in uncomfortable but not inhumane conditions in a secure location, while negotiating indirectly with Arthur Vance through intermediaries. His demands were not financial, as everyone expected, but rather the public exposure of the construction firm's illegal practices, including the covered-up work accidents and corruption schemes involving public contracts. Arthur refused to yield, confident that he would eventually find his daughter through conventional methods. It was Emily who suggested to Jack that she might get direct access to more sensitive information if she could secure a permanent job with the catering company that frequently worked at the Vance residence. The idea was risky but promising, and Jack initially hesitated for reasons that had less to do with strategy and more with a growing reluctance to put her in danger. But Emily insisted, arguing that she had as much right as he did to seek justice for what that family had done, and eventually he relented. The plan worked better than they had hoped. Emily got the position of residential events supervisor, which gave her regular access to the Vance mansion on the Upper East Side and direct contact with the family. It was during one of these visits that she met Eleanor Vance, Arthur's wife and Olivia's mother, a 50-year-old woman who exuded a cold elegance and deeply buried unhappiness. Unlike her husband and daughter, Eleanor treated the staff with a distant cordiality that could pass for kindness if it weren't so obviously mechanical. Emily observed the family closely for weeks, noticing tensions and secrets that no outsider would perceive. She discovered that Arthur and Eleanor's marriage was a sham maintained only for appearances, that Olivia had been spoiled to the point of sociopathy as compensation for her parents' emotional neglect, that Ethan came from an equally dysfunctional family and clung to Olivia more for status than genuine love. The most revealing discovery was a heated argument Emily accidentally overheard between Arthur and his lawyer, where it became clear that he was more concerned about the kidnapping's impact on his business than his daughter's safety. Sharing these observations with Jack in the following nights created a new intimacy between them. It was no longer just about revenge or justice, but about understanding the complex web of power, privilege, and human misery that connected them all. Emily began to question her own assumptions about morality and law, while Jack, for the first time in years, considered if there were other ways to achieve change beyond force and intimidation. The turning point came when Emily discovered documents during an oversight by Arthur, at an event that proved not only the negligence in the work accidents, but a systematic pattern of fraud and exploitation that went far beyond what Jack suspected. It was evidence that in the right hands could completely destroy Arthur Vance's empire. She photographed everything discreetly and passed the information to Jack, knowing she was crossing a point of no return. That night, after delivering the photographs, Emily and Jack finally gave in to the tension that had been building between them for weeks. What began as an impulsive kiss inside the car, parked at a lookout with a view of the illuminated city, quickly turned into something much more intense. They made love with a desperate urgency, as if they both knew that time was running out, that the consequences of their actions would eventually catch up with them and tear them apart. Afterward, lying in the back seat of the car with their clothes disheveled, Emily asked Jack what would happen when it was all over. He answered with brutal honesty that he didn't know, that he had never planned that far ahead, because men like him rarely lived long enough to worry about distant futures. But for the first time in his life, he admitted, he was starting to want a future. And the image of that future inexplicably included her. Emily should have been frightened by that declaration, should have recognized all the warning signs of getting involved with someone dangerous and unstable. But instead, she felt a wave of tenderness so strong it hurt, because she recognized in that masculine vulnerability a mirror of her own secret desires. She also wanted more than the limited existence life offered her, wanted to be seen and valued, wanted to feel that she mattered in the grand scheme of things. Events precipitated when one of Jack's contacts in the police warned him that Arthur Vance had hired a private security firm, composed mainly of ex-cops and military, to find his daughter through extra-legal means. This completely changed the game, because it meant that Jack and his men were now up against trained professionals who would not hesitate to use lethal violence. Emily was also in danger, because any professional investigation would eventually trace connections between her and the kidnappers. Jack made the difficult decision to release Olivia and Ethan, but not before forcing a final meeting between the victims and Emily. He wanted that spoiled girl to understand that her actions had consequences, that the waitress she had never noticed existed was a real person with a real story and real power. Emily initially resisted the idea, fearing the confrontation would further jeopardize her safety, but Jack insisted it was important for both women. The meeting took place in the same warehouse where Olivia and Ethan had spent weeks in captivity. The girl was visibly changed by the experience. Her veneer of superiority cracked to reveal a frightened fragility. When Emily entered the room and Olivia recognized her from the party, there was a moment of confusion, followed by horrified understanding. Emily then spoke, her voice firm and clear, explaining exactly who she was, who her father was, and what the Vance family had taken from her. She described in clinical detail how Arthur Vance's negligence had killed a good man, destroyed a family, and perpetuated a system of exploitation that treated working lives as disposable. Olivia cried, but Emily felt no satisfaction in seeing her tears. Instead, she felt only a deep sadness for the futility of it all, for the recognition that even this moment of poetic justice would not bring her father back or fundamentally change a system built on inequality. Jack watched the exchange with an indecipherable expression, but Emily could see something shifting behind his eyes, a reassessment of his own certainties about revenge and retribution. The release of Olivia and Ethan was carefully orchestrated. Jack left them in a public place with instructions to remain silent about their captors under penalty of having the evidence against Arthur Vance publicly released. But he underestimated the combination of anger and privilege that motivates people accustomed to always getting what they want. Olivia immediately told her father's private investigators everything, including detailed descriptions of Jack and vague mentions of a waitress who had been seen talking to him. Emily discovered she was wanted when she arrived for work and found detectives waiting at the entrance of the building where the catering company's office was located. She didn't wait to be caught. Instead, turning and running through the busy downtown streets, her heart beating so hard she could barely hear the shouts behind her. She called Jack from a payphone, her hands shaking so much she could barely dial, and he instructed her to meet him at a specific address. The safe apartment was in a housing project in Hunts Point, the same neighborhood where Jack had grown up. It was small and Spartan, just one room with minimal furniture, but it represented temporary safety while they decided on the next step. Emily collapsed as soon as the door closed behind her, all the weeks of accumulated tension finally catching up to her. Jack held her as she cried, his large but surprisingly gentle hands stroking her hair, murmuring promises they both knew he might not be able to keep. They spent 3 days in that apartment, hidden from the world, as the manhunt intensified outside. The news spoke of a massive police operation searching for the criminal leader responsible for the kidnapping of a prominent businessman's daughter, with rewards being offered and political pressure for quick results. Emily watched the reports with growing despair, realizing there was no possible return to her old life, that everything she knew and loved was now out of reach. It was during those days of forced confinement that Emily and Jack truly got to know each other, beyond the layers of physical attraction and strategic necessity. They talked about their lives with a brutal honesty that is only possible when there is nothing left to lose. Jack told her about the first time he killed someone, at 16, defending his territory from a rival gang, and how that act had fundamentally changed something inside him. Emily shared her constant fear of becoming like her mother, defeated and bitter, drained of all dreams, until only survival remained. They made love again, but differently from the first time. There was no more desperate urgency, but a painful tenderness, as if each touch were a farewell. Jack traced the curves of Emily's body as if memorizing a map to territory he knew he would lose, while she explored his scars, one by one. Each mark a story of violence and survival that had made him the man he was. On the third night, Jack finally shared the plan he had been silently developing. He couldn't just run away and start over, because his power and influence depended on his physical presence and territorial control. But Emily could. He had contacts who could arrange for false documents, passage to another country, enough money for her to start over far away with her mother and brother. It would be a sacrifice. It would mean abandoning everything familiar and known, but it would guarantee her safety. Emily interrupted him before he finished, her voice firm as she said she wouldn't run without him, that if they were to start over, they would do it together, or it would make no sense. Jack tried to argue that it was impossible, that he had responsibilities and loyalties he couldn't just abandon, but Emily was relentless. She forced him to confront the truth he had been avoiding, that his quest for power was actually a quest for worth and recognition, that he had built a criminal empire trying to compensate for the feeling of being invisible and disposable that society had imposed on him. The ensuing argument was intense and at times cruel, both of them hitting each other's vulnerable points with devastating precision. But through that brutal honesty, something crystallized between them. Jack finally admitted that he was tired of the violence, tired of living each day expecting to be betrayed or killed, tired of being the monster everyone expected him to be. Emily recognized that her own quest for security and respectability was partly cowardice, a fear of risking and failing, a preference for a known misery over the frightening possibility of something better. The solution came from an unexpected source. One of Jack's trusted men, an ex-cop who had joined the organization after being kicked off the force for reporting corruption, suggested using the evidence against Arthur Vance not for blackmail, but for public negotiation. If they handed over the documents to the independent press and regulatory bodies at the same time, creating a scandal too big to be covered up, Arthur would lose his influence and political protection. Without these safeguards, he would be vulnerable to real investigations into his crimes, including the deaths on his construction sites. The plan required Jack to expose himself publicly in a way that went against all his survival instincts. He would have to appear in an interview confessing his involvement in the kidnapping, but at the same time contextualizing his actions within the broader system of injustice that produced them. It was risky because it likely meant prison, but it also offered the possibility of changing the narrative, of forcing a public conversation about inequality and exploitation that was usually silenced. Emily supported the plan because she saw in it the possibility of real justice, not just personal revenge, but a systematic acknowledgement of what had been done to her family and thousands of others. But she insisted on appearing alongside Jack, sharing her own story and taking responsibility for her actions. It would be professionally and socially suicidal, but for the first time in her life, she would choose visibility over safety, truth over convenience. The interview was arranged with an investigative journalist known for her work exposing corporate and government corruption. They met in a makeshift studio in a low-income neighborhood in the South Bronx, surrounded by residents who formed a kind of human shield against any attempt at violent interruption. Jack spoke for 2 hours, his narrative beginning with his childhood in poverty and progressing through the impossible choices that led him to crime, but also including a devastating critique of the economic system that produced endemic misery and then criminalized its victims for trying to survive. Emily complemented his story with her own, describing her father's death and her family's subsequent struggle, the brutal contrast between serving champagne to millionaires while barely being able to afford her mother's medication. She spoke of the systematic invisibility of poor workers, how they were simultaneously essential and disposable, how society depended on their labor but refused them basic dignity, and then, with a voice that did not tremble, she presented the documentary evidence of Arthur Vance's crimes. The reaction was explosive. The evidence was too irrefutable to be ignored, the timing perfect with Olivia just released, and Arthur vulnerable from the public exposure. Federal prosecutors had no choice but to open investigations, while investors and business partners quickly distanced themselves from the Vance firm. The empire built on exploitation and impunity began to crumble with surprising speed. Jack was arrested immediately after the interview, as he expected. But the arrest was televised and public, with hundreds of residents from the communities he controlled forming a vigil outside the police station. The narrative the media tried to impose of the violent criminal finally captured was complicated by the nuanced reality he and Emily had presented. Debates exploded on social media and television shows about poverty, crime, and social responsibility. Emily was not immediately arrested, but lived under constant investigation. Her mother and brother were relocated to a safe place with the help of Jack's organization, protected from potential retaliation. She herself stayed in the safe apartment, giving remote interviews to journalists who wanted to explore the issues raised more deeply, unexpectedly becoming a public voice on inequality and social justice. Jack's trial attracted national attention. Prosecutors sought to convict him of kidnapping, extortion, and a list of other crimes, while his defense argued for mitigating circumstances and systemic failures. The case became a microcosm for larger debates about criminality and social responsibility. Emily testified on his behalf, not denying the crimes, but contextualizing them within a larger framework of injustice. Simultaneously, Arthur Vance faced his own increasingly serious legal problems. The investigations revealed not only negligence in the work accidents, but elaborate schemes of corruption involving public contracts, money laundering, and even connections to high-ranking politicians. His fall was spectacular and complete, ending with his pre-trial detention while awaiting trial on multiple charges. What surprised Emily was the public reaction. She expected to be demonized as a criminal's accomplice, but instead found significant support from people who saw her as someone who had finally challenged an unjust system. Offers began to come in. Organizations wanted to hire her as a consultant. Publishers proposed books. Even universities invited her for lectures. It was dizzying and sometimes frightening, this sudden transformation from invisible to influential. Jack was sentenced to 12 years in prison, a sentence considered relatively lenient given the accused crimes, but reflecting the court's recognition of mitigating factors. Before being transferred to a federal prison, he and Emily had one last private visit. It was painful and complicated, both knowing that their reality had been fundamentally altered, that any future together would be radically different from what they had imagined. But it was also surprisingly hopeful. Jack talked about using his time in prison for formal education, maybe even completing a college degree. Emily shared plans to work with labor rights organizations, using her new platform to push for real changes in conditions and protections for vulnerable workers. They didn't make impossible promises of eternal love or faithful waiting, but they acknowledged that they had changed each other in fundamental ways, that what they shared had value regardless of what the future held. 2 years later, Emily had established herself as an activist and consultant, working with organizations focused on labor rights and social justice. She used the substantial compensation finally won through the lawsuits against the Vance firm to establish a fund that supported families of work accident victims. Her mother, with access finally to proper medical treatment, improved significantly, while her brother finished high school with plans for college. Jack, in prison, was a model inmate who spent most of his time studying and organizing educational programs for other inmates. They maintained regular correspondence, long letters that explored ideas about justice, redemption, and the possibility of change. The letters gradually evolved from an accounting of what each was doing to more intimate exchanges about feelings and the future. When Emily visited him in prison every 2 months, as the rules allowed, they talked about plans for when he got out. It would be difficult, they knew, because Jack would always carry the stigma of his criminal past and the connections that would keep him under constant surveillance. But there were also genuine opportunities to contribute positively, using his experience and unique perspective to help other young people avoid the destructive paths he had followed. The physical attraction between them had not diminished, intensified by the forced separation and the emotional maturation of both. Their visits often ended with urgent kisses in the brief moments before the guards intervened, whispered promises of a future when they could be together without bars between them. Emily was not waiting passively, actively building a life that would have space for him when the time came. But that was also complete and meaningful on its own. Jack's parole request was approved after serving 5 years of his sentence, taking into account good behavior and positive contributions within the prison system. Emily was present at the hearing, her testimony about his transformation and their continuing relationship weighing on the judicial decision. When he finally walked out, thinner but somehow stronger, they hugged for long minutes in the prison parking lot, both crying without shame. Rebuilding a life together was not easy or romantic in the way movies suggest. Jack struggled to adjust to freedom after years of institutional routine, while Emily had to navigate the discomfort of some people in her professional network about her relationship with an ex-convict. But they worked through each challenge with the same brutal honesty that had characterized their connection from the beginning. Jack got a job at a community organization focused on youth gang intervention, using his experience and street credibility to reach at-risk youth. Emily continued her advocacy work, expanding into issues of criminal justice reform. They lived together in a modest apartment in the East Bronx, near the communities where they both grew up, their lives intertwined in practical and profound ways. The marriage proposal came during an ordinary evening, with no grand production or expensive ring. They were cooking together, an activity they had turned into a daily ritual of connection, when Jack simply turned to Emily and asked if she wanted to make official what they were already living. She said yes without hesitation, because she knew that what they shared was stronger and more real than any conventional romance could be. They had met under impossible circumstances, transformed each other through challenges that would have destroyed weaker relationships, and built something authentic on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. The wedding was small and intimate, held in a small community church in Hunts Point, with only close family and friends present. Emily's mother cried with happiness to see her daughter radiant in a simple but beautiful dress, while some of the men who had worked with Jack in his former life attended, their presence a show of loyalty that transcended moral judgment. It was not the glamorous union society deems ideal, but it was real and true. Years later, Emily would look back on that fateful night when a tattooed man was humiliated at a luxurious party, and she made the impulsive decision to show compassion. So many things had changed since then. Injustices had been exposed, if not completely corrected. Lives had been transformed. A system that seemed unshakable had at least been forced to acknowledge its flaws. Jack had become not the criminal the system wanted him to be, but a genuine agent of positive change in his community. They didn't pretend that everything was perfect or that they had completely overcome the circumstances of their origins. Jack still carried trauma from his years in crime and prison, still struggled with moments where old instincts of violence and distrust emerged. Emily still had nightmares about her father, still felt anger when she saw workers being treated as invisible and disposable. But they faced these challenges together, with the strength that came from having survived the worst and found love in the process. When people asked how they met, they usually simplified the story, leaving out the more complicated and morally ambiguous details. But between themselves they shared the complete imperfect truth, recognizing that their love had been born not in spite of difficult circumstances, but somehow because of them. They had seen each other with brutal clarity from the beginning, without romanticized illusions, and had chosen each other repeatedly through every impossible test. At night, lying together in the modest apartment they had made a home, they sometimes talked about that spilled wine that had started it all, how an act of casual cruelty had triggered a sequence of events that exposed systemic injustices and transformed multiple lives. How the public humiliation of one powerful man had been the catalyst for delayed justice and improbable love. The irony was not lost on either of them, this way that seemingly small moments could alter entire trajectories. Jack would hold Emily in his arms, his body muscular, but with the softness of approaching age, his tattoos now familiar and beloved instead of intimidating. She would trace the designs with idle fingers as they talked about plans for the next day, for the week, for the years to come. They had learned to live in the present while building a future, balancing realistic hope with gratitude for what they had already achieved. It wasn't the fairy tale ending that novels romanticize, where all problems magically disappear and love conquers all without effort. It was better. A real relationship built by two imperfect people who chose to work daily, to be worthy of each other and the love they shared. They had started as strangers from opposite worlds, united by revenge and necessity, but had become true partners, united by deep understanding, mutual respect, and a commitment to a justice greater than themselves. And when Emily finally slept in Jack's arms, listening to the comforting sound of his deep breathing, she knew with absolute certainty that she had chosen right, that all the terrible risks she had taken, all the bridges she had burned, all the painful transformations she had gone through, had all led her exactly where she was supposed to be, home. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story with a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.